Visit Tudor Place through April 21st to experience ancestral spaces, people of African descent at Tudor Place. Curated in collaboration with the descendant community, this multifaceted tour gives voice to the enslaved and free people who lived and worked here, and recognizes the site was supported by the forced labor of generations of Black laborers. Tours Tuesday through Sunday. Advance registration recommended, but not required, at tudorplace.org. Today on CityCast DC. Over the years, the Smithsonian acquired more than 280 brains from around the world. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but studying people's brains to try and justify race science was a thing. More than a quarter of the brains still held by the Smithsonian today were from mostly Black people from the DC area. Now, a Smithsonian task force says those remains should be repatriated. Nicole Dungca is a Washington Post reporter who has been covering this slow and evolving process, and she's here to explain it all today. Oh, and after the interview, our executive producer, Priyanka Tilve, is chatting with the folks from our sponsor, Tudor Place, about how to visit the historic house and garden and why you should. Stick around to learn more. Today's Tuesday, March 5th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. So I was reading your reporting on this story, and honestly, I could not believe it. It sounds like something out of some sort of a messed up eugenicist horror film. What is going on? Like, what is the deal with the Smithsonian and this collection of brains?
It is quite surprising, but at that time in the early 20th century, this wasn't very rare at all. And many museums would collect human remains, and they were saying it was for various research projects, and a lot of them came from Native American communities. What we found is that the Smithsonian actually had a collection of human brains that primarily a man named Alice Hrdlicka had collected. He was the chief anthropologist at the time, was a curator of the Division of Physical Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History.
Do you have a sense of the scope of this? Like, how many people's brains were taken without consent? And have any been repatriated to the families of the people who lost them?
So what we were able to find by looking through the documents and then also talking to prior employees in the office that worked on returning these remains and repatriating these remains to their rightful owners, we found that the Smithsonian had collected more than 280 brains around the world. And right now they have 254 brains still in storage in Suitland, Maryland. They've only returned 5 of those brains, and one of them was only returned after we did the reporting and contacted the family, who was really shocked by what we had found.
One of the things that your reporting makes really clear is that these remains come from all over, but it is harrowing how much worse it was for the DC area specifically. A quarter of the collected brains were from this area, right?
Yeah, when we're looking at the brain collection, there were 74 that we were able to find that were from local people. And of those, 48 were actually Black and from the Black community. And we did find that surprising because it basically did show that, while the vast majority of human remains that are collected across the country were largely from Native American communities because their graveyards were basically dug up in many cases. When Hrdlicka was starting this brain collection, we saw that he was starting within his own backyard. He was enlisting local institutions and doctors to help him remove their brains to build this collection that he called the racial brain collection. That's a term he actually used at the time. And so, we were seeing that many of them, at least 19 of them came from fetuses, 17 came from children. There were 3 taken from the hospital that served the city's almshouse, which were basically where indigent people lived. So these were a lot of vulnerable populations that were basically being targeted for this collection.
And the thing that he was trying to prove, which we know is like completely baseless junk race science, is that the differences between races based on brain size.
So, in what we've read from Alice Herdlichka and his speeches and his letters, is that we know that he did believe in eugenics. He believed in eugenic thinking and did believe in the superiority of white people. And so while he was collecting all of these brains, he did have a big interest in collecting the brains of Black people and other people of color because he wanted to do more research on them. And what we found is that he didn't do much research at all on them. We couldn't find many studies that showed anything, but in some of his letters, he would say, "Oh, this research shows, some sort of superiority with white brains," but he wouldn't be able to point to any of his studies.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun. But with Paulson and Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson and Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. The two partners, Chris and Matt Nace, were both born here and are local leaders who care deeply about the DC community. Paulson and Nace handles medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases when someone has been hurt by the negligence of others. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson and Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So, if you have been hurt or have lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson and Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com or call 202-463-1999.
Shipping can make or break a sale, so optimize how you ship your orders with ShipStation. They make it easy to automate and manage orders no matter how big your business grows. And they might even be able to help reduce shipping and warehouse costs. So optimize and keep up your momentum for growth with ShipStation. Sign up for your free 60-day trial now at ShipStation.com and use the code POD. That's ShipStation.com with the code POD.
So one of the things that I feel like your piece really makes clear is that this might seem like it was something, that was very long ago, but you actually talked to people in Washington whose ancestors, they had their brains taken. And so it makes you really understand that this is not an issue that is ancient history so far away. What did the folks that you talked to tell you about this?
I'm glad you brought that up. That's really well said. It does sound like it's so far back in history, but from our reporting, we talked to people who had their first cousin had their brain taken for this collection. That was somebody in Seattle with family in Alaska. And in DC, we were able to talk to someone whose great great grandmother's brother was actually in the collection. And so that means that these are actually people's relatives. And when we were reaching them and reaching these families, they were really surprised by what they had seen. We talked to the relative of someone named Moses Boone, who was basically a toddler when he died of tuberculosis and his brain was taken in Washington, D.C. And we talked to his relative, Michelle Ferris, who still lives in the area. She hadn't heard about this, but she felt like her family had been robbed. She said she was surprised, but also, could see those kinds of things happening because she knew, being a Black woman in America, her grandfather had been very wary of various doctors and institutions because he had felt like they would take advantage of him. And when we told Michelle this story about one of her relatives, it made her think of those fears that her grandfather used to have. And so when we were talking to them, they were really surprised and they wanted to help get their relatives' remains back from the Smithsonian, where they're holding them basically in a storage facility in Suitland, Maryland right now.
So the Smithsonian, if you all hadn't have done this reporting and looked into it, the Smithsonian would have just, I guess you maybe don't know, but my sense is would have just kept these brains in storage without even trying to contact the families, if not for you all doing this reporting?
The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, which holds the vast majority of the human remains in this institution, they are actually required to alert tribes and native Alaskan, Native American, and Native Hawaiian communities about the remains in their possession. And that's because there is a federal law that was passed in 1989 that basically said, you have to let these communities know so that they can get their remains back. In all, the Smithsonian has more than 30,700 sets of remains. And within the brain collection, they still have those 254 brains left. So what we found is that because there was no law requiring the Smithsonian to really notify any communities outside of those Native communities, that many of these brains were just not getting returned or repatriated.
And I guess because the Smithsonian is a nonprofit, they kind of can make their own rules in a kind of way.
Yeah, so the Smithsonian is an interesting institution. It was established by Congress. It's heavily subsidized by Congress, but it's its own what they call trust instrumentality. So it's not officially a federal agency. So some of the laws that might apply to other agencies don't apply to them. They're not subject to the same records laws that other federal agencies would be subject to. And there's actually a larger repatriation law that applies to basically all the other museums that get federal funding, but the Smithsonian has its own law regarding repatriation that it has to follow, and that was passed by Congress. But essentially, yes, they are able to make up many of the rules in regards to its repatriation outside of being required to notify the Native communities about the human remains in their possession.
Does Monday at the office feel like a storm? Not with Microsoft Copilot. That feeling when Copilot gets everyone up to speed instantly? It's sunny again. When Copilot simplifies complex data so your teams can act, that sun's shining on a beach. And when Copilot uncovers hidden insights, you're on that beach with your people, and you find buried treasure. That's Microsoft Copilot. Learn more at Microsoft.com/AI for all.
This episode is brought to you by FX's Shogun, the official podcast. Each week, host Emily Yoshida is joined by the creators, cast, and crew in this exclusive companion podcast. They dive deep into the twists and turns of the plot, go behind the scenes, and explore the real-life history that informed the limited series based on James Clavell's best-selling novel. Search FX's Shogun wherever you listen to podcasts.
How did the Smithsonian react to this reporting? Like, were they defensive? Were they helpful? Were they apologetic?
So we used a lot of documents that were available to the public from the Smithsonian's archives, but the Natural History Museum did help us with some of the research that we needed. So while we were reporting this story, they did restrict access to human remains. They did hire two researchers to look more into repatriation. And they created a task force to figure out the policies on returning these remains and how human remains can be used in research. And then after we published, the Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bunch III, actually apologized. He apologized in an interview with us, which we included, but he also published an op-ed in the Washington Post apologizing for the way that many of these remains were collected, because many of them were collected without any consent, and that's what we saw from our research. And the task force that he convened has been meeting so that they can create these new policies. And what the secretary said is that this new policy will help steward the return of all the remains and will also be what he called historic. So we do think that there is a possibility that there will be, some instructions or requirements that are regarding some of these remains that are not governed by current legislation.
So when Hrdlicka was taking and collecting these remains, was it legal in DC to exhume bodies without a permit? What was the legality around this?
Yeah, so we asked an expert on, laws governing human remains. It was a woman named Tanya Marsh. She's a senior associate dean at Wake Forest University School of Law. She believed that, the people who did this kind of collecting at the time didn't believe that the laws applied to them. That's what she said. And when she was looking through some of the local statutes, she did not think that this was done legally because there were still requirements that basically said, even if human remains were used in some sort of exhibit or something like that, after a certain amount of time, they would have to be buried or cremated. And as we saw with our reporting, many of these remains were not buried or cremated. They're still in storage at the Smithsonian.
What's next for this story? Like, do you think that the Smithsonian is going to make an actual good faith effort to repatriate the remains? Might there be any legislation to protect Black bodies and Indigenous bodies in death?
We are waiting on the report from that task force that will be coming out this year. Basically, it will help inform a new policy for the Smithsonian and how to repatriate all of these remains. But there is a possibility in legislation. There is legislation in Virginia right now that was introduced that would require the Smithsonian to return the remains for people in that state. And there is a possibility, that other legislators could work on legislation that would be able to force the Smithsonian basically to notify some of these communities.
Thanks so much for being here, Nicole, and for your reporting on this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And listeners, don't go anywhere. In just a second, we've got a segment sponsored by Tudor Place. Our team lead, Priyanka Tilve, is talking to the Historic House's executive director about the creative and eye-opening guided tour they've got running through April 21st.
Hey, I'm Priyanka Tilve here with Mark Hudson. He's the executive director of Tudor Place. It's a historic house and garden in Georgetown, and it's open to visitors. And Mark, I'm so curious to learn more about this tour that you all have designed called Ancestral Spaces. What will visitors see when they experience that?
Well, so each of the tours here at Tudor Place during this will focus on the experiences of the individuals who were forced to support the lifestyles of their enslavers. And so, for instance, in the dining room, where we normally have very fine dishware set out, what we will be showing there are shards of ceramics that have been recovered from an archaeological investigation that was done here in an area that was the site of an enslaved dwelling. Visitors will be entering rooms from the entrance that the service staff would have been using. So it really is turning on its head the standard tour that focuses more upon the wealthy Peter family and is looking at the historic house from the perspective of enslaved people who lived and worked here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never heard of something like this in this area, so that's really cool. I imagine that setting up a tour like this, designing something like this, takes a lot of intention and research. How have the voices of descendants been incorporated into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have been working with, our curatorial team in particular, been working with an advisory committee that includes descendants of enslaved individuals. And this entire idea, this concept really came from them. So we are indebted to them for their help with this. But another way that descendant voices will be heard and experienced in this exhibit will be through oral history recordings that will be part of the presentation as well. In 1993, Tudor Place conducted oral history interviews with Hannah Nash Williams, who was the granddaughter of Hannah Pope, who was enslaved here at Tudor Place in the 1830s and 1840s. And so in these recordings, Hannah Nash Williams will be sharing the reminiscences of her grandmother as she knew her, but also talking specifically about a visit that she and her grandmother made here to Tudor Place in the early 20th century. So that's really as close to a direct connection with descendants as we can get with the resources that we have.
Wow, that's amazing. How long is this tour?
Our tours are generally about an hour.
Sure. So at the end of that hour-long tour, it sounds like it's very immersive and thought-provoking. What do you hope people will take away from it at the end?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that we hope that people will get from this, first is really just to see that whole history of Tudor Place. And one of the things that I really hope will come through with this as well is about the enduring impact of this as well. And that's one of the things that's been important in our discussions with the descendants of enslaved people here at Tudor Place, is how that experience still affects their lives today, and how the trauma that was experienced by their ancestors is experienced by them today.
For sure. That's so important. When it comes specifically to ancestral spaces, how can people sign up for that? What are the dates? How do people get tickets?
Yeah, so we'll be offering guided tours through April 21st, and those are available Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 3. These are offered on the hour, and then on Sundays from 12 to 3. And we strongly encourage people to register in advance for these. We believe there will be a great deal of interest in this. And so they can simply go to tudorplace.org, our website, and sign up for those.
How can people who want to learn more about enslavement at Tudor Place specifically do that?
We certainly advise people, recommend that people go to our website. It is rich with resources and information about enslavement at Tudor Place and in the District of Columbia. So you'll find, in addition to some essays and links to resources, we also have profiles of individuals who were enslaved here as well, and we're continuing to add information to those as well.
Mark, thanks so much for being here. Again, check out tudorplace.org to learn more. We'll have that link for you in our show notes as well. Thanks for listening.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe to our newsletter and don't forget to rate and review. And check out the show notes for more information about the Ancestral Spaces Tour at Tudor Place. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.